Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you. We're delighted to have you joining us for what will hopefully be an interesting workshop where we're looking at the work that's being currently done and ideas moving forward in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion. So let's start with introductions. My name's Margo and I'm the Programme Director for the Doctorate in Clinical Psychology Programme at the University of Southampton, and I'm also the Widening Participation Lead for the Psychological Professions Network South East. And Bill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Margo. So likewise, thanks all for joining and welcome to the session today. I'm Bill Tiplady. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I'm the Chief Psychological Professions Officer for Oxford Health, and I'm the co-chair of the Psychological Professions Network in the South East.
Thank you, Bill. So today we'd also like to say a massive thank you to the people who are joining us today, and I'll be introducing the panel a little bit later, but I'm going to hand over to Bill, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about what we're talking about today.
Thanks, Margo. So the title of the session today, as you'll be able to see on the screen, is When the Psychological Professions Network Meets Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. How have the psychological professions navigated barriers relating to EDI, including suggestions for future work? So, as some of you may remember, Margo and I co-chaired a similar session last year where we focused much more on recent initiatives to kind of promote increased diversity and wider access into the psychological professions. So this year we wanted to have a more reflective session and to give some space to hear about people's different experiences of navigating those professional journeys, and to hear about a range of experiences across different roles and different career levels. So that's going to be a bulk of the session today. We really hope that you find that thought-provoking and stimulating, maybe resonates with some of your own experiences and prompts some reflections. And I suppose our position is that these issues of difference and diversity are for all of us to reflect on and to engage with. We want this to be an interactive session, so please do submit your thoughts and questions via Slido, which I think you should be able to see and access on your screen. We'll be seeing those questions coming in and we'll have a chance later on to respond to as many of those as we can. And we'll certainly be looking at all the thoughts that come into us. So thank you very much for participating in that. I'm going to hand back over now to Margo, I think, who's going to do some introductions of our fantastic panel members.
Thanks, Bill. So as I said, we've got recordings of our colleagues' thoughts in the area, but we've also delighted and a massive thank you to some of the colleagues who are able to join us today. So first of all, we have Paul, who's our expert by experience. We also, there they are. So Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
By experience. It's a pleasure to be here and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Margo.
It's great you could join us. And over to you, Susanna.
Hi everyone, I'm Susanna. I'm one of the co-directors of Child and Young People's Mental Health Trainings at King's College London, so I'm here from the perspective of a mental health trainer.
Thank you, Susanna. And Anita.
I'm a consultant psychologist at Surrey and Borders Partnership Trust, and I'm here as a panel member.
Thank you, Anita. And Leila.
Hi, Margo and everyone. My name is Leila Lawton. I'm a senior cognitive behavioural psychotherapist. Work for Keeping Well South East London, but also provide some support in Talking Therapies Southwark. I'm also here in my capacity as chair for the BABCP Equality and Culture Special Interest Group and the chair of the Race Equity Working Group at SLAM.
Thank you. And the person who couldn't join today is Tansy, who works for the Leeds programme, but we've got her recording here so you can hear what she has to say. And the format is my colleagues are going to speak in different orders. And most importantly, we're going to start with the words of Paul and end with the words of Paul, because that's why we're all here today, is to support people to get as well as they can on their own emotional journey. So it feels really important we start and finish with our expert by experience. And so now it's over to the recording, and you'll see when we interview Paul that the question that Paul's responding to is at the top of the caption, and everybody else will be talking about their experiences from their relevant professional career. So I hope you enjoy the recordings. Please keep your questions, thoughts and comments coming in on the Slido as it goes along, because we'd love to hear from you all. And I hand over to the recording.
I have identified 4 subheading for the challenges that currently I find we face. Obviously, this list will be quite extensive as well, and it depends on each individual's experience. But firstly, I'll say denial. Secondly, would be dilution or confusion. Thirdly, would be escapism. And fourthly, would be lack of knowledge. I will go into each subheading in detail. So we'll start off with denial. From experience and analysis and long-term observations, I find that there seems to be a sense or a hint of denial across sectors, industries, and the public in general. Therefore, are we really ready to be real and take ownership of our history and all the discomfort it has caused and is still causing to many people across the globe? Or are we just merely, tapping ourselves on the shoulder and saying, we're doing the right thing, which leads us on to dilution and confusion. There is what I find heavy dilution within the definition and interpretation of the term equality and diversity inclusion, EDI. For instance, following the Black Lives Matter movement, there was cohesive momentum throughout the world for EDI and representation within social and professional settings. Off the bat, there was obviously the requirement for clarity regarding EDI within the professional world, which resulted in the acronym BAME being realized as insensitive and therefore scrapped. Following this, we begin to see in the EDI momentum that further categories were added, such as LGBTQ or non-binary individuals, and these became mainstream focus. For instance, what I mean by this, when caring for an individual, there needs to be clarity of direction and thought process. It would be very counterproductive to have a service user within a therapy session whilst their immediate family and extended family and friends are present within the same confines of the therapy at the same time. I find this is what is currently happening on a larger scale within EDI, which now leads us to the next issue of escapism. Are we then therefore disguising representation of what is suitable for us or within our comfort zones in order to cleanse or reassure our conscience that we are being good or doing things right? Or are we in fact avoiding the core issues and discomforting conversations in order to avoid confrontation or conflicting views, as in make life easier for ourselves? For clarity, I am merely hinting that EDI representation should therefore have guidelines for categories or socio-demographic of the population. For instance, in relation to biologically assigned opposite gender parents who are leading a family or other groups of the socio-demographic that makes up our population. How much is the current percentage of representation within the EDI figures across the board for each of these categories or the socio-demographic? And what percentage of the representation should then be expected or achieved for fair, balanced inclusion? Finally, the lack of knowledge. I will then also hint from findings that, and I think the term lack of knowledge is optimistic in relation to other terminology that could be related to this current stance, is therefore evident. So yes, lack of knowledge is therefore evident. Again, all of these challenges are what I have found from experience. These could be the list could be a lot longer. It could be a lot more vast in relation to each individual's experience across the board. So yeah, as previously mentioned, the thought process for the professional service should be, or the professional who's providing the service should be, are we merely cleansing our conscience or reassuring ourselves that we are doing things right? For instance, is it just tokenism, or are we just ticking boxes, or do we actually really care? There's an old proverb that says, doing things right and doing the right thing aren't always one and the same. Now, I'll repeat that for a moment, and I would like people to just take this into consideration and reflect. Doing things right and doing the right thing aren't always one and the same. Now, I believe that any wise and conscious person who knows right from wrong is equipped to answer the proposed question effectively in relation to each scenario we face on a daily basis. So this question, you see, is not in fact as straightforward as it seems, especially within the psychological profession. As the saying goes, no two fingers are the same.
I am Dr. Anita Jenkins, and I am a consultant counselling psychologist at Surrey and Borders NHS Trust, and I currently work in a community mental health team for the South West. From my background, I'm a dual-trained psychologist and psychotherapist, and what that means is that I provide therapeutic input, consultation and supervision with the provision of evidence-based biopsychosocial practices and clinical leadership, ensuring that services within our trust operate in a safe, effective and efficient way as part of a whole system of mental health services. I also have a specialist interest in neurodevelopmental disorders, and I'm actively engaged in providing a professional forum for reflective practice supervision in groups. How have I learned about issues of diversity and inequality in the psychological professions? To be succinct, I would say that I've learned from first-hand, personal, lived life experience. I've worked in NHS settings and in various positions throughout my 20+ year career in the NHS, ranging from acute psychiatric hospitals, secondary care, community mental health teams, child and adolescent mental health teams, forensic services, and GP integrated primary care teams. I've also worked in central London, the west, north and southeast of England in those various positions, to mention a few locations. And despite the different locations, it's sad to admit that I've always experienced pockets of marginalisation because of my ethnic origin. It's not always obvious that I'm experiencing that at the time that I'm experiencing it, and it can sometimes take me by surprise. And I think today's terminology for my experiences could be summed up as microaggressions, which I've often been on the receiving end of. And at the time that I'm seeing it or experiencing it, it does shock me that it still happens. So if I think about my lived life experience and I put that to one side, I've always wondered what more I can do to support more candidates who, like me, come from a diverse ethnic background and want to find a way into the field of psychology. Here today, in my role as a consultant counselling psychologist at Surrey and Borders, I've been given ample opportunity to work with my colleagues. One to mention would be Dr. Catherine May, to look at ways of encouraging candidates from diverse backgrounds into the psychological profession. So last year, I was invited to be a reflective practice supervisor for the Division of Health Psychology. This was for their pilot project on widening participation. Following pre, mid-placement and post-outcome measures, we received immense support from universities and the internal division at Surrey and Borders of Psychology, and we devised a poster to summarise our project and showcase the findings. The poster was called Mapping the Void: What deters applications from training and limits the impact of underrepresented groups on professional practice, and our findings from the supervisors and supervisees on this project were phenomenal. To mention but a few, the candidates found that they had low confidence about psychological knowledge and had misconceptions about the role of a psychologist, or their other misconceptions were that they didn't have any value to add to the therapeutic process in an occupation like this. Equally, the supervisors were catapulted into a new forum for learning as they acknowledged the importance of creating a workforce that has an open, safe space to discuss issues and to have formal structures and processes in place for candidates from diverse backgrounds. We're currently in the write-up stage and hope to publish our findings for the pilot project. And this has coincided with a new project on widening access to psychological professions, in which we've just acquired 8 paid roles to employ assistant psychologists from disadvantaged backgrounds to join us at Surrey and Borders for a period of 6 months for 3 days a week to experience the role. So we're currently navigating the recruitment process and ensuring that we are inclusive as possible in the process of gaining placements with various different teams within our trust. So when I think about the suggestions for future work, I think about where are we now within this project. And my current suggestion is that we look at the recruitment process and the questions we ask assistant psychologists about their skills and experience, and that we find ways to make this process inclusive and not exclusive. This is a piece of work that we are currently working on, and we are working closely with our HR team at Surrey and Borders on how we advertise, ensure that our recruitment processes are fair and transparent. We're also, as part of this process, reviewing the interview questions, ensuring that we also have a diverse representation of clinicians from the different teams and, where possible, from diverse minority ethnic backgrounds that will be a part of the panel and feed into the recruitment process. And my last suggestion would be that, where possible, from our learnings, we share the results of our projects to widen participation, because this is the only way we can share the knowledge and we can learn from one another, so that we can continue to aspire and learn from each other in this profession.
Hello, my name is Tansy Warrilow. I trained as a clinical psychologist, and I now work part of the week in forensic services and for the other half of the week as EDI and anti-racism lead for the University of Leeds. I work privately also with a colleague as race equity and social justice consultants, offering training and consultancy. So my work involves EDI in terms of a number of the protected characteristics, specifically and probably predominantly thinking about race, gender, and understanding anti-Muslim and anti-queer narratives within our work. But today I'm going to focus on talking about race. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging that as somebody who's racialised as white, it means I don't have experience of racism, and I'm not impacted in the way that people who are minoritised are. However, I do know that I can see it in operation, I can see that I benefit from it, and I can see that it's alive within our systems and within our professions. This is at odds with my values of fairness, justice and equality, and I know that as somebody with a good deal of power and privilege now, I have a responsibility to be involved with challenging that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the anti-racism initiatives that I've been involved with across my roles. So some of these include allyship. Allyship, I think, can be a tricky word, but that's probably a conversation for a different day. But by that, I mean thinking about working with organisations, teams, and so, for example, BME networks, to think about how we can use our voice alongside other people's voices to really challenge racism within systems. We're currently developing an allyship network programme to work alongside the BME network to really challenge some of the issues within the trust that I work within. I've recently been involved with using my research skills to analyse a patient survey. So we explored service users' experiences of racism within the hospital and used this to explain to senior leaders that we needed to take more action. I have been involved in a number of different teaching sessions, ongoing and one-off. These are for psychology colleagues, for other members of the multidisciplinary team, and for senior leadership. I believe that we don't know what we don't know, and so it's really important to provide awareness, education and knowledge to people when it comes to understanding race. One of the problems, I think, is that people have a fear of talking about it. People don't have the resilience to talking about it, and so often it becomes avoided. So I'm really passionate about supporting people to have those difficult conversations, become comfortable talking about the uncomfortable. Within my work, this means when we're thinking about training clinical psychologists, this means supporting academics, lecturers, as well as supervisors, so that everybody involved with that training programme is developing their skills to talk about difference and diversity. One of the things we've recently done is embedded a cultural humility competency within the competency framework. So that's not to suggest that people will ever become competent in talking in cultural humility, but it's about engaging with the skills of cultural humility, engaging with talking about difference, reflecting on biases, understanding how racism shows up in us and within our teams. And I've also been involved in a number of outreach projects, so thinking about mentoring, offering support to schools, colleges and universities who may have students who are interested in clinical psychology but don't know where to go or where to get information. So really thinking about bringing people into the profession who have different life experiences and different lived experiences. So there's probably more, but I'm going to move on to talking about some of the barriers that I've noticed when doing this work and then thinking of some suggestions for how to take it forward. So I think one of the main barriers is that change is often met with resistance, and it can feel scary. Addressing racism within our organisations, within our professions, within our work can feel confronting. It often evokes shame and guilt and defensiveness. So one of the barriers that I've experienced is people or teams not feeling able or willing to address the problem in itself. I think that this is made worse at the moment, particularly within the NHS, which is a very burnt out system. We know that it's under-resourced. People are working over and above what we used to due to short staffing. So the ability to kind of think and hold difficult feelings, difficult discussions is reduced. There's a lot of compassion fatigue and limited space to think. I think what can happen, another barrier alongside that, is that anti-racism work or equality work can be pushed aside and be considered as something that is an added bonus rather than a fundamental aspect of our work as clinicians. So some of the things that I have done in terms of taking that forward or getting around that, and things that I would advise for other people to think about, is something somebody taught me was about having a drip approach or a broken record approach. So keeping it on the table all of the time. By doing that, we stop it from being swept aside, but it also helps build people's capacity to understand racism and think about racism, tolerate having those difficult conversations. So things like sharing podcasts, books or events that might be happening around, keeping things on the table, sharing initiatives that I might have come across. I learned to push it where it moves. So by that, it means not giving up, but not burning out all of my energy in one area if there's very little change. So keep chipping away at the areas of a lot of resistance, but also moving where people are willing to learn. So an example is there was one team I was working with within my clinical role who I was finding it very difficult to organise some training for and get very far with that. So I began to just share things online. However, there was another team, another member of the multidisciplinary team who were very active and wanted to learn more. So we did some reflective practice sessions together. So it's about pushing in all ways and not getting burnt out when the door feels really closed. Another thing my supervisor told me, which I really recommend, she taught me to take forward, is to fail better. So she said, don't try and get it perfect every time because you'll probably get it wrong. So when you do get it wrong, take accountability, learn, move forward, and just fail better next time. And that way we don't get stuck and we don't get paralysed by failure.
Mental health trainings at King's College London. We're one of 13 nationally commissioned universities currently offering these trainings. We're lucky in that we train practitioners who are directly treating children and young people and their families, but we also train their supervisors and the leads of their organisations. So there's some opportunities for influencing cultural shifts and changes. I'm really pleased to be here today to hear from the other panellists and the audience as well, to help us with ideas for improving our practice in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, as it's very much needed. I'm going to tell you about some national data. We have views from our students on our EDI practice. I'll tell you what's happening nationally and what we're doing locally as well to try and improve things. And I'll have a think about the main barriers from our point of view as trainers, and what we might be thinking about doing to move forward. So we heard from our students across the country. We had over 800 respondents on our practitioner training courses, which was a decent response rate of about 57%, slightly higher in the more diverse areas of the country, even up to 90%. So hopefully representative data. We discovered that our students, against census data, are representative of the children and young people that they serve in terms of ethnicity and sexuality and other protected characteristics, although it looks like we need to be a bit more sure of the data, but it looks like sadly that becomes less true the more senior they become. So that's obviously an area that we need to work on. We also discovered from the students that it's a highly vocational training. Most want to stay in the profession, and in particular they want to progress to more senior roles within the profession. And that feels really important, because if we can retain our more junior representative workforce into more senior roles, you've then got a chance of real cultural shift. Some more concerning findings that we discovered were that our students are not educationally diverse, probably by virtue of training through universities. Most already have an undergraduate or postgraduate degree. Luckily, some universities across the country provide the trainings as either undergraduate or postgraduate programs, but we're still not managing to recruit those who don't really already have either of those qualifications. So we need to do some work with the universities in terms of being able to recruit people who don't have necessarily traditional educational backgrounds but have lots of experience. So that feels an important area to work on. We significantly underrepresent males. That's often true of psychological professions in particular, but it's a real problem for us. A really key finding is that when we asked students about the barriers that they have to feeling at home and belonging on the course, while white majority students tended to cite themes of remote learning and accessibility in that regard, students from minoritized ethnicities very clearly were more likely to cite themes along the lines of equality, diversity and inclusion, awareness in teaching staff, representation in teaching staff, and also in terms of the teaching content and really thinking thinking about it with regard to the children and young people that they serve. It's a real problem, and a very clear message from our students that it is not currently good enough. So what's happening nationally? One big important thing is that the commissioners have recently developed a new, more senior role that will come into place next year, which feels really important because it's supporting a bit more of a career structure to more senior roles within the system. That feels really important for supporting our trainees to develop their careers. In addition to that, the Psychological Professions Network have done a lot of work recently on accreditation pathways as well, and professionalisation of the workforce, which also feels really, really key in terms of progression. We are linked in nationally with a mental health inequalities working party led by Councillor Jackie Dyer, and one of the things that they are hoping to do, which feels really important in that working party, is provide a blueprint with minimum training standards with regards to equality, diversity and inclusion, which is really key because that has been absent from our curricula so far. And new working parties to refresh our curricula led by Health Education England are going to link into that work, and importantly to improve our curricula, because at the moment it's very variable across the country about what people provide, but we know that across the country it's not good enough anywhere. So that feels really important to be guided nationally. In addition, both our commissioners, HEE and NHSE, and also our universities are more and more asking us to provide direct evidence for what we're doing, specifically in terms of programme delivery and content in terms of EDI, which gives us a further level of accountability and monitoring, which feels really crucial in terms of moving forwards in this area. Regionally, there's a lot of work being done on targeting student and staff recruitment. There's more EDI training available for staff, both recruiting managers and also in terms of the teaching content. We do try and train specific competencies with concrete examples of how to manage EDI in clinical practice, and that's also formally assessed in terms of their video submissions of clinical work. We also encourage students to submit assignments that are focused specifically on increasing awareness of equality, diversity and inclusion and accessibility of their services. Because we know that students learn what you assess them, it's really important that issues of EDI are built into the assessment structure. I know that nationally most universities have joint student and staff working parties with specific terms of reference that need to work towards improving our practice in this area as trainers. We asked our students every session for feedback on whether EDI was considered in teaching, and we directly use their feedback to improve teaching as we move forward. So we're hearing from a lot from our students who are very active in trying to improve us in this regard, so we're very grateful to them. So I don't need to say here how many barriers there are to this work. There are many, and that could be a very long conversation, but there's two from my point of view as a trainer which feel really key. One is the lack of the skills and the lack of awareness of best practice throughout the system, a lack of availability of best practice throughout the system, and related to that is also a lack of confidence and a fear of talking about these issues and these difficulties in our practice. So very valuably, a student who's also a tutor of ours mentioned to us the other day that when we train risk, that can often create a lot of emotion, a lot of fear in our students and from the teachers, and it's very difficult. It can bring up tricky issues, but we would never shy away from teaching this. And it's the same with issues of marginalisation, discrimination and equality of provision, abuses within the system, what our children and young people are experiencing in their lives in general. So we mustn't shy away from that, even if it sometimes feels difficult. So moving forwards, a really key thing for me is consulting with experts by experience and people who have a really good working knowledge of the most up-to-date research in this area. It also feels important for us to be contributing to research in the area, but also in terms of confidence, providing a safe space to talk about these issues and to improve them and to reflect upon them continually, because it's the only way that we'll move forward. And as a very trusted and esteemed colleague said to me the other day, the main thing is that we really need to be doing the work, and we need everyone to keep doing the work, not only the people who are already marginalised by an institutionally biased system. And it's all of our responsibilities to right mental health inequalities in practice. And as a trainer, I know that we're not doing well enough, and I know that we need to improve. So, as I say, very grateful to be here today to hear from you all, and really looking forward to hearing some ideas for moving forward.
Hi, my name's Leila Lawton. I'm a senior cognitive behavioural psychotherapist. I'm also the British Association for Behavioural and Cognitive Psychotherapies Equality and Culture Special Interest Group Chair. Bit of a mouthful. I'm also the Race Equity Working Group Chair for South London and Maudsley NHS Trust. I work with Keeping Well South East London, and also I'm linked in with Talking Therapy Southwark. Ibram X. Kendi recently retweeted an excerpt from the Black lesbian feminist Audre Lorde. We have all been programmed to respond to human difference between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways: to ignore it, and if that is not possible, copy it if we think it is dominant, or destroy it if we think it is subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. So for me, I think I really need to contextualise what we're actually doing here. Equality, diversity and inclusion as an umbrella term may be an outdated concept, similarly with the term BAME. So the merging of such a broad remit of protected characteristics under this banner may prevent efficacy in targeted work for and within specific communities. Similarly, with such a broad global majority of people, BAME may not be fit for the acronym's purposes. Language plays a role in positionality. Although use of the term people of the global majority is now used speaking broadly across different racially minoritized communities, with regards to clinical work and research, specification as to whom we refer and who's representative in specific population samples, whether they are British Ugandan, East African Bengalis, South Asian, Gypsy Roma, we think that it provides better clarity, and it requires effective ethnicity recording within all mental health trusts. That's one of the suggestions in terms of our progression and how we can monitor and review how well we're doing in terms of the outcomes. So equity is preferable to equality because equity recognises differences and attempts to counteract unequal individual opportunities, and equality suggests that the playing field is even. So beyond representation of therapists from underrepresented ethnicities or genders within senior workforce roles within the mental health professions, this too needs to correlate with the individual service will, ability and reflexivity to make structural change, which increases access, improves experiences and outcomes, both for the people we provide therapy for and for the staff who share those protected characteristics. Dr. Hassan wrote an article entitled EDI, Endless Distraction and Inaction. It spoke to issues of minimal progress on this agenda despite multiple initiatives. We know a shift is required both top down and bottom up to recognise responsibility in ongoing review and work towards measurable progress in equity and inclusion, which is reliant on a commitment to a metaphorical sharing of the burden and weight of this work, to dismantle racism and address all types of discrimination, including but not limited to ableism, sexism, Islamophobia, homophobia and transphobia. In light of my limited time frame, I'm focusing on ethnicity and will refer to some intersections. Intersectionality refers to particular forms of intersecting oppressions, for example, intersections of race and gender or of sexuality and nation. Intersectional paradigms remind us that oppression cannot be reduced to one fundamental type, and that oppressions work together in producing injustice. We know that women are more likely than men to receive treatment for all mental health conditions, with 15% of women receiving treatment compared to 9% of men. Young people aged 16 to 24 were found to be less likely to receive mental health treatment than any other age group. White British people are more likely to receive mental health treatment, 13.3%, than people from racially minoritized groups, who are at 7%. The lowest percentage of people receiving treatment were those from Black ethnic minority groups, 6.2%. Again, we would need some specificity around what that Black term is represented in that context. And these are statistics from the Mental Health Foundation. What we know in terms of navigating barriers is that good intentions are not sufficient in ensuring meaningful change. What have we seen so far? I know from the BABCP's perspective, there's been a real commitment in terms of considering teaching and looking at the curriculum alongside with national IAT teams to make sure that it's fit for purpose. Attempts to kind of decolonize starting attempts to decolonize the curriculum and make sure that issues of racism and discrimination are taught and people are supported to continue that learning. The main barrier is funding and resource. We need capacity for sustainable impact, ongoing learning and growth. There needs to be implementation of the BABCP Positive Practice Guide for racially minoritized communities that helps services and clinicians to refine and review what they're doing on a day-to-day basis so they can meet the needs of their local population. Reflective and reflexive spaces situated within every discipline of the psychological professions are imperative to demonstrate services and individual clinicians' ongoing commitment to learning and observing our internalized prejudices or outward biases, where consideration needs to be given to when there may be a need for spaces specific to different ethnicities and when spaces may be inclusive of people of combined ethnicities. To navigate the barriers effectively, I would propose that every trust holds a centralised research solutions hub. We're looking to do that at South London and Maudsley. This is for projects focused on improvement, access, experience and outcomes for racially minoritized communities, alongside the development of different hubs with congruent aims for different protected characteristics, where we may see some crossover due to intersectionality. So we have to consider how many pilots does it take to land. A network of emergent evidence from quality improvement projects and service evaluations and pilots, if modelled and developed further, may enable feasibility studies for larger studies and research trials, where there will be more representation in the evidence base that's specific to working and meeting the needs of people who aren't always represented in the population samples for the empirical evidence on which the psychological interventions that we use are based. Ongoing CPD training on racism in line with every kind of psychological and therapeutic modality, cultural humility, cultural safety, and the commitment to lifelong journey in pursuing cultural competence is required. But how? Funding needs to come from centrally to make sure that the issues of burnout, the issues of highly driven, target-orientated mental health services are able to equip their staff and their workforce to feel that they can engage in this imperative work and take up specialisms and move this agenda forward. We've been having discussions in this area for many years, decades, beyond the lifetime of my experience. And we just have to really consider the tangible steps that can be taken. And if the barriers are in the system and in the lack of finance and funding, that's just upholding and continuing the institutionalized racism that prevents this to be more than a tick box exercise. Because to have a space to talk about without providing the tools in which to fix the problem is quite frankly meaningless. So we really need to think about what is in the way of us applying these tools. There may be a will, but who's preventing us creating that way? Because we've got a range of ideas, and I could speak on this topic for years, quite frankly. We need to see the change today because people are dying and people are overrepresented in very severe institutions within the mental health provisions that we support. We see it in the statistics. Life trajectories of people from racially minoritized communities have the school to prison pipeline. We know with the statistics around perinatal mental health for Black women, for Bangladeshi women, for Pakistani women. What does this mean for the people we support with the issues going on around the world globally? People of Iranian descent, Ukrainian descent, from Yemen, from Syria, from Afghanistan. We have such skilled therapists and psychologists within services who just might need a bit of space to be able to even process, or specific roles funded to enable this to really come to fruition. So the ideas are great and they're there, the initiatives are great, but how much are they being implemented on the ground? The BABC Positive Practice Guide was published in 2019. We really need to see this not as best practice, but as standard practice. If we're really committing to this, we're not just about navigating the barriers, we need to really consider how we're going to dismantle them long term, and that may take time, but we need to really pick up pace with this work.
The message I would like to bring today is simple. Take ownership of our history. Accept it. But don't dwell on it. Simply learn from it, and most importantly, do the right thing by and for the person mostly affected or influenced by our services or encounter. If this person we are caring for had been our own flesh and blood, would we not want the best for them?
So much to reflect on from everything we've just heard. I know certainly for my part, it's hard to kind of pick out, I suppose, what to respond to. Although some really fantastic, I think, thought-provoking and inspiring things said by all of our panel members. I'm going to offer a couple of reflections, then I'll move on to Margo, and then we'll hear from our panel members. I suppose the things that stood out to me was I suppose a theme of, some things have been achieved, but we've got a long way to go. I suppose Paul talked about ticking boxes. Have we ticked boxes without really making some of the changes that we need to see? Tansy talked about kind of failing better, the idea that actually maybe we need to be bolder at trying to take actions. Susanna, I think, said something really positive about how the intakes to some of the newer psychological professions really have changed, and that's a headline bit of news which I know was flagged in one of the other sessions this week, that we really are seeing much more representative groups of staff moving into some of those newer roles in particular, but that still hits a roadblock sometimes as people move into more senior roles. And then Leila was talking about, the fact that there really continue to exist major structural inequities which require long-term and really determined work and solutions. So I think, really a lot for us to reflect on, including people like myself who are in, senior roles in terms of NHS services and in the psychological professions network, and definitely highlights, I suppose, the importance of our keeping on focusing on this area of work. Margo, I'm going to hand across to you, I think, for your reflections.
Thank you, Bill. Well, first of all, thank you to our speakers once again. There's so much in there, but one of the things that struck me quite from the beginning was how much work is being done, that is moving on. 5 years ago, we were nowhere near this place where we are. And of course, this is a massive, massive topic. And we're climbing up a huge ladder, but it certainly feels like we're climbing up those rungs steadily and steadily. So for me, some reflections, I think, first of all, Paul spoke so passionately about the importance of inclusivity and intersectionality. And of course, we're all complex beings and we all have differences between us. And when he mentioned about moving beyond tokenism, and I think that is so important. It has to be meaningful work within this. And the need for us as health professionals, whatever profession we're in, to really increase knowledge and take our own responsibility to increase our knowledge in the areas. Then moving on to Anita, I love the fact that this was full of actions. It's full of excellent work that's being done there, and a massive well done to Anita for presenting it so well. I really like the work around interviewing, and I would absolutely echo about the selection, having mixed panels, and really thinking about your questions, because it's really important our panels reflect the people we're trying to recruit. And also based on research, which as an academic is so important for me. And paid opportunities. Really glad to see. I've seen this initiative happening around the country, and I saw it raised lots of interest, but paid opportunities by trusts to give people the opportunity to work. And indeed, I'm asking universities to do the same, and we're looking at what we can do on our programme. So it's really important that we're helping people to start on their own step ladder in their career. Then moving on to Tansy, who talked about allyship and also talk about working with senior leaders, and that emphasis she has on challenging racism and that it's everybody's responsibility. And I think that is so important. And I loved when she put the broken record approach, because I sometimes feel it's a bit like me. I'm like a broken record with this, but I don't care. I'll keep on doing it whilst people are listening. So really packed full of the work that Tansy's doing there up in Yorkshire. And then over to Susanna and the importance of staff support, particularly when we're retaining staff. And I noticed in the comments people were putting about people from diverse backgrounds well-being. I think staff support and retainment should be considered across the entire workforce and have a multitude of different ways of support. Some of them will be culturally specific, and some of them may be other parts of the intersectionality spectrum that we want to consider. Also, Susanna mentioned gender differences and the importance of the underrepresentation of men, as well as looking at joint working and really liking that, working together from an educationalist perspective with staff and students. I moved on to Leila. Well, I could listen to Leila all day. She's such a passionate speaker. But one of the things that I found fascinating, she's challenged my thinking on, is the word equity rather than equality. Because I quite agreed, we're not there. We're not on an equal playing field yet. And so it's looking for equity, which feels important, and also navigating those barriers, and that good intentions are not enough. Good intentions are lovely. I can have good intentions not to eat a chocolate bar, but I'll still eat it. The good intentions need actions behind them, and that's going back to what Tansy and the flavour today is about, it being all of our responsibility. And I saw on the Slido as well the importance of funding, and funding opportunities coming in and being maximised is so important. So thank you to all our speakers, and now I would like to invite each one of our speakers to come onto the call to give their reflections. So Paul, if I could start with you.
I think all of the points that were raised today it was all in unison in a sense. At the same time, they're very important points. You can't pinpoint any particular point above another. And it clarifies the importance of the message that's being communicated today. And not only that, but the impact that it's having across the board, all over the place, not just in the NHS, but this is something that we experience on a daily basis, and it is everyone's responsibility. At the end of the day, we share the space in the world together. So yeah, do the right thing.
Thank you, Paul. Absolutely. Do the right thing, everybody. Over to you, Susanna.
Thanks, Margo. I particularly loved hearing about all the work that's happening, and I'm really there's been in the comments people want to have some links to that, and I'm very keen to. It's really going to expand our knowledge. Just a few things that really connected with me. One was Paul talking about particularly denial and escapism, and the alternative to that being ownership of the problem, which feels really, really key. And Anita, you saying about some of the results of your study, people feeling like they have nothing of value to bring, really connected to me, because as a trainer that is never true. And everyone contributes so much richness, and we need trainings to include everybody. And Tansy, again, talking about the resilience to talk about the uncomfortable feels really, really key as well. There was a really strong theme of that throughout the talks. And Leila, always so inspiring, and reminding everyone to really build on the research that's actually happening at the moment feels so key. And also you bringing that sense of urgency to it feels really, really important. This needs to happen now. Awful things are happening, and we need to act. So that was really, really, I feel very motivated to act now, and like I've got some ideas. And just really that sense of well-being and belonging feels really, really important. And Margo, please be a broken record. It's really helpful.
Oh, thank you, Susanna. I will. And over to you, Anita, for your reflections.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on Paul's point very briefly. Are we ready? I don't think that we're ready for EDI in many ways. I think people are so concerned about getting it wrong or getting their terminology wrong, that people don't tend to say anything at all. So I think if we're really going to go forward, we need to offer a lot more support about people's questions and much more guidance and guidelines on this. In terms of some of the questions in the chat, I would love to share our findings, and I shall do so via Margo. I'd love to share the poster and showcase what we found and what we did. So very, very much welcome that opportunity. And in terms of the job at Surrey and Borders going live, that will be going live at the end of this week, if not early next week. If you know any candidates, please do send them our way. We'd be really, what's the word? Can't get my language right. We'd be really enthusiastic about hearing from them. But thank you, Margo.
Thank you, Anita. And the job has caused quite a lot of interest on Slido, so yes, do share it widely. And it's over to you, Leila, for your reflections.
Thank you, Margo. It's so powerful. I feel really privileged to be on this panel amongst such esteemed colleagues, and starting with Paul, just that the way that you really broke it down and talked about denial and dilution, and I can really that resonated with me. You know, what these titles that cover up a multitude of different groups sometimes don't serve the purpose that they were set for, and we need to think about specifically who are we speaking about, you know. And again, Anita, I love how you brought in that lived experience and, you know, that positionality and all of the things that you spoke about that many different universities can learn about in terms of their recruitment processes. Sharing this knowledge is really important. And I know at King's, building on what Susanna had said, in some of the spaces that I've been privileged to be in, there's a lot of work underfoot, making sure that diversity isn't just one session in a module. We're looking at all the different areas, from LGBTQ to working with disabilities to, you know, we're not trying to put everyone in one box, what we consider intersectionality. For me, I think what's really important as well is that reflective spaces ongoing for staff in all of the different modalities and in the different trusts. Reflective spaces are really integral to be provided ongoing support for people to continue to do this learning. We're not going to get there overnight, but when there's a commitment to this and there's resource, we can do this collaboratively and target places to get more funding. Let me pause there because you know, I'll just go off on a tangent. But thank you.
Thank you, Leila. You're always welcome to go off on a tangent. Excuse me for looking to the side. I was just looking at the Slido questions that came through. So thank you, panel, for your reflections. And Bill, was there one final reflection you felt you didn't get the chance to make that you'd like to make now?
Well, there was, because I completely sailed past acknowledging Anita's contribution, actually, and the fact that, and I think what I took from that actually was of two halves, really. Firstly, I suppose the ongoing experience that Anita described of what she notes in her day-to-day working practice, and the concept of microaggressions, which we've had some attention in the Slido, which we might come back to a bit later, but also I guess that great innovative work, great that Anita, you were able to update that those posts are going out. I should say, from the point of view of balance, that lots and lots of trusts are offering out those opportunities. There's been a big recent Health Education England funding round for those opportunities. So if you're not in Anita's part of the world, do have a look and see if your local mental health trust are also advertising those, because there are a good number of opportunities. They'll be going live at different times. I know ours have just closed, and we've just recruited into a number of those roles for people who otherwise would kind of face barriers in getting their first step on the psychology career ladder. So it's so really great that innovative work is going on, and we'll be hoping to share that more and see if we can do more to share the work of Anita and others on the panel. Thank you, Margo, for coming back to me on that. I really appreciate that.
No problem, Bill. And just so you know, the best place to start to look for those kind of opportunities is on NHS Jobs. They will, yes, yep. Just checking that. So have a look on NHS Jobs. It's always worth just registering your details on there and seeing what comes up. For those of you who have no idea even where to start, NHS Jobs would be the place to go. Right, Bill, I'm handing over to you now for the first question.
So it's questions. So my eyes will dart around the screen a bit as well, because we're all into the modern day technological multitasking here. So I'm looking across at the Slido window. So our currently highest voted question is, I think, a really important one. So to read out the question to begin, so people from some ethnic groups see mental health and psychology quite different to the standard Western white picture. How can this be addressed? So I suppose my reflection on that question, then I think Anita had said that she was going to come in and say something to that. I mean, I think this is a very live and important and profound issue, really. I know as part of some of the kind of initiatives around EDI that have come into the world of clinical psychology training, there's been this concept of decolonizing the curriculum. And I think that's probably a really big subject area. I know when I trained as a psychologist, I trained at the University of East London, and that was something that we were privileged, I think, to have quite a bit of teaching about that and quite a lot of consideration of that, actually. To what extent were the models that we were learning about and being trained in the product of a very particular lens, a particular way of looking at human beings and society that, you know, we might look at again in 50 years' time, or we might look at from a different cultural perspective and see as really quite unusual and peculiar. And I think across all of our professions, we have to be ready to acknowledge that, actually, that we approach things through the lens of theories and models, actually, that are only one way of looking at things, and actually sometimes can have really important implications in terms of which voices they allow to speak and which voices they close down. I think that's something that as practitioners we have to really think about when I'm applying this formulation or when I'm applying this model of therapy. What am I allowing to happen in this interaction, and actually what might I be closing down, might I be closing my ears to, perhaps without necessarily meaning to, and how can I be reflective about that and try and address that in working with people from across a range of backgrounds. So that's my kind of initial response to that question. But Anita, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts were in relation to that question, and then we might come to others also.
So I have many thoughts on that question. Thank you for asking, Bill. One of my thoughts is about psychology, and having studied psychology to a doctorate level myself, thinking about the theories of psychology and what we apply when we're working in a mental health setting with our patients. And a lot of the theories that we apply are thinking about the individual as an individual. And for myself, I come from an Asian background, a community setting. And so thinking about myself as an individual has been difficult. And so when I think of applying that kind of an individual reductionist theoretical model in my patient group, the two don't quite translate. So I think sometimes we need to think about the mental health of the person sat in front of us and what it is about the setting they're in that might be impacting them, and how that then affects the family. So we do a lot more family intervention work nowadays than what we used to. And I do think that that's a really important part of the work that we're doing. We really need to be thinking about the individual and their relationships and the relationships they have around them, and not just as the individual. See, whatever they change for themselves is going to have an impact in how they are in their setting around them, be it in their relationship, be it in their family. If you come from a culture like mine, you're going to be sat in a family setting. How's it going to impact the rest of the family? So we need to be offering much more psychoeducation information, not just to the patients or the individual, but for the family or the family setting that they're in. That would be my thinking.
Thank you, Anita. I think that's really helpful, and I think something there about the importance, you know, across spectrums of difference in thinking about how people exist in a personal, social, cultural context, and thinking about do we find out enough about that to be able to really understand some of those things. Leila, I think I'm going to pass over to you as well to hear your response to this question, and then perhaps we'll come back to Margo.
Thanks, Bill. I think there's been significant progress in terms of cultural adaptations in cognitive behavioural psychotherapy, and acknowledgement of the limitations with population samples not always being representative, and I think across the board in all the modalities actually of people from more racially minoritized communities. We recently launched the CBT journal recently launched the page on how to be an anti-racist therapist, with a range of resources around different adaptations within different communities. But effectively, I think the systems may get in the way of people being able to review the information so then they can apply it in clinical practice. If there's not the reflective spaces that are going alongside parallel to the work that's being delivered, because it's ongoing, it needs to be prioritized, and people need to actually think about looking at themselves. So we're always looking outwards at the other, the marked identity, but fundamentally acknowledgement of bias and prejudice, understanding of reflexivity as a therapist in any modality is key, and that's ongoing work that's required. So it's about making sure that the spaces are there from the point of training, and then when we are actually in full-time qualified clinicians, how we're continuing to access that CPD and how it's prioritized, but the systems have a part to play in making sure it's mandatory actually, and that these spaces exist specifically to think about how we can work differently with others. And of course, those who are interested, get involved. If you want to write a paper, make contact. You are part of the difference. You are part of the change. Because actually, if it's not fit for purpose and when not one size fits all, let's see about creating a new emerging evidence base that is more effective for the people that are most marginalised.
Thank you, Leila. And I think some of what you're saying there connects a bit with something else I see coming in on the Slido, saying the psychological professions really need to embrace EDI as a skill set, not just about being nice, in inverted commas, and recruit to these competencies rather than hope for the best. So I suppose that idea of we have to build in that competence in a much more systematic way. And I do think you're right to say, Leila, that there has been progress in that. That isn't to say that that's an issue that's resolved by any stretch, but I think there is much more attention paid to those issues across different professional trainings. So I think I'm going to hand then over to Margo for the next question. Margo, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Bill. So just before I go with the next question, there was an interesting question in the chat, which is specific to clinical psychology, about the person experienced transphobic kind of responses from courses. If I could ask that person to email me, then I can share that with the directors group and see if we can make an active change on that. So please do email me, give me some examples. We need to learn, and perhaps we can even set up a meeting to talk about that one. So coming on to another question in the slide, I thought was very interesting. And the question is, how would you deal with anti-racism spaces being dominated by white members of staff? As for example, I assume in reflective practices and spaces like that. I was really torn with that question, because on the first instance I thought, goodness me, white staff turning up to reflective spaces with relating to anti-racism, that has to be a bonus, because that's allies there. But then I thought, oh, is it? Because the person's putting that question, it's obviously not meeting their need. And then I thought about the importance of having separate spaces. That I do think there are spaces where people should come and talk about anti-racist experiences and learn from one another, no matter what their heritage and background. But I also firmly believe there's a need for spaces, protected spaces for people of, let's use me as an example, of colour, to go and reflect on how things impact upon me personally. So my response to that would be to speak with whoever, or be bold, depending if you feel able to create a space that fits for you and your needs, and to talk openly with the service setting that you're in to create that, because I suspect you won't be the only person wanting that. So that was my thoughts. I'm going to pass over to Leila to hear her thoughts.
Thank you, Margo. At South London and Maudsley, we started to do some work around this and get feedback with our diversity forum about what's going to be most effective. And what we found so far is that it would appear that there is sometimes a need for spaces that are very specific to white psychological people from the white psychological professions to come together where it's psychologically safe to really think about whiteness and that social construct and what that means in terms of privilege and how it shows up in terms of how we work and how we support others. And then there also may be a need sometimes for racially minoritized staff members to come together in a space separately. But then there may be a point that it makes sense for these groups to be merged as well. And I found in my experience that, it's people might be fearful about saying the wrong thing, but it's more important that they do the work and recognize the bias, because otherwise they're going to harm people. and we would just want to prevent that harm from happening. So to be supported to reflect and grow and understand prejudice and how we all have it and how it might show up and how to address it is the most key thing here. So I hear what they're saying, and like you similarly thought, well, good, show up, because you need to be in these spaces so you can learn. But I think the danger is when people are taking on roles, specifically because EDI has become a bit of a tagline, and there's funding and there's roles there, so people want to get the roles but they don't have the heart and they don't have the passion behind actually making the changes. That's when it's more problematic, I think.
Thank you, Leila. Completely agree. And Anita, your thoughts on this one?
So my thoughts are not that dissimilar to what Leila said. Really appreciate what you've said. But I've had a number of colleagues say to me, this has happened, but I don't know how to approach it. And they've got to consider their registrations as well. So I do think that there isn't enough guidelines, there isn't enough guidance, and there isn't enough support. There is a desire and want for people to want to approach things differently, but there's just not enough robustness out there. And I do think, for me, being Asian, being able to be slightly more outspoken about topics like that, it's probably because I feel more comfortable being able to do it. If I don't do something differently myself, then I can't expect the workforce around me to be able to do that differently. When you're white, that might be slightly different. So I'm not saying that's an excuse to not do it at all, but I wonder if there are a number of reasons why they don't come forward. Thank you.
Susanna?
Margo, I didn't hear you. I apologise. I wasn't sure if you'd said my name. I apologise. Yeah, I was listening to that, just thought what an important point that it is, and it's very helpful to hear. And I'm particularly thinking of during the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement, some of our student working parties had a lot of difficulties, and some minoritized ethnic students were saying to us, actually it was incredibly painful to have white people realizing their privilege in front of us. That was really difficult. So we began to realize the value, I think, or to cement the value for us of having some safe, separate spaces, as well as coming together and just being very thoughtful about protecting people in those spaces. And I think it's just that thing where it might be difficult to say, but it needs to be said. And actually also just perhaps senior people and facilitators being aware of how that's a really difficult issue for some people to speak up about, but they probably then need to intervene and think about how to manage things. But it feels really, really an important point to make, and I'm glad it's made.
Thank you, Susanna. Okay, Bill, it's over to you for the next question.
Thank you, Margo. And I think, in terms of that question, I think it's, my thoughts were kind of mixed in a way that I think this idea of a space being dominated, that feels like that's not a space then that is being led in a safe way. But I suppose as someone who has been involved with some different areas of work in relation to EDI with a kind of ally status. So both in terms of work in relation to race, work in relation to LGBT, I think I have to recognise that there's something important, I think, for me to engage with those pieces of work and commit to being part of that, but also recognising, I may, as a white man coming into those spaces, bring a particular sort of power, a particular sort of expectation, and be really mindful of what impact that might have on other people around. So it does seem important to think of it from those different perspectives. So the next question is almost a more specific one about terminology, and it came, I think the term was initially used by you, Anita. And the question is, I wonder whether we need to reconsider the term microaggressions, given that the impact is macro and profound. So I guess it sort of comes from the idea that, maybe the word microaggressions inadvertently sort of minimalizes or trivializes something actually which we should think about as a much more serious and significant issue. And I think, was that something that you were going to answer, Margo, in the first instance?
Yes, it's an interesting point, that one, because I do teaching on microaggressions. And funny enough, the last time I was teaching it, I thought, this doesn't feel micro. And I think that's a developmental journey for me, myself, as a black woman, that actually this isn't micro. And I actually use my real life examples as part of the training for people, because I think it adds weight if people realize this is still happening and this happens every day to people. So actually, you've got me thinking that it really shouldn't be microaggressions, and they are macroaggressions, and particularly how they land with people, they definitely feel macro. And I then thought, who came up with the term microaggression in relation to this? And I then wondered the ethnicity of that person who came up with the term microaggression. So it's quite deep. I've gone. Thank you to that person for that question. But I think it's an excellent point, and I will be changing my teaching based on that point, which is what hopefully then will have a knock-on effect to people who are delivering teaching. So thank you.
Thank you, Margo. I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in and say anything on that question. I suppose it's the way sometimes terms come into our consciousness actually, and then carry with them a sort of connotation that maybe we want to go back and revisit. I suppose there's been something important about the idea of microaggression because it captures the way that things can slip into everyday interactions in a way that some people might not notice or not be able to initially be aware of, but it does really feel that it's important to acknowledge actually the really significant, profound impact that those things have. You know, it's not something which is minor in any sense. Margo, I don't know if you've picked a question for us to turn ourselves to next.
And do keep the questions coming in. We've probably got time for one more. But I'm looking at what has just come in that was carrying on about our point about, I agree with having a space specifically for BAME members. How do you explain the idea to someone who feels that space would discriminate against white people? And I just wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that. My initial thoughts, while you're all thinking about it, was I think we need to look at the research when we're stating things. I know the next question is going to be, well, where's the research? It is there about protected spaces, and I think that's helpful, but also just ask. And you can say that this has been found to be helpful on, for example, clinical psychology training courses, because we've now routinely created them. And I'm working with one trust to offer mentoring safe spaces to their clinicians of colour. So it is coming through. And so work with the resistance, find your ally, talk to the right people to ask about the change, and put it in a positive light. That, you know, it would be great if we had this in addition to the spaces, because the needs are different. We can have both and, not either or kind of narrative. Leila, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm just agreeing with you, Margo, 100%. And I wanted to just share, I've got a colleague who leads on work with the LGBTQ plus community and delivers workshops within a psychological therapy service. And he wouldn't have anyone running the workshop who didn't belong to any part of the LGBTQ plus community, because it wouldn't be safe for the workshop in terms of what is discussed, in terms of what people are reflecting on, working through, processing. I couldn't run that. I don't have lived experience of those challenges. We may have shared experiences of oppression, but it wouldn't be suitable for me to lead that space. So in response to that question, I think it is really important to think about why the function of the space is there in the first place. And I think there's opportunities where we will have a mix of different people from different backgrounds, and we'll have shared learning, but there's necessary times for people to be safe within the groups that they belong, to be able to talk on such painful topics freely. And yeah, so sorry, I'm waffling now, but that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. And I think the lived experience argument is a really important one for that person if they're putting it to their setting, that the value of having people with lived experience to share, normalise is so important. So I'm going to move on to what will probably be our last question of today. And the question is, I'm sure burnout can prevent people from engaging in anti-racism. I wonder whether white supremacy is the real reason we don't make much progress. So it's a bold question, and I'm going to start with Bill to hear his response to that question. So,
I mean, I guess what in a way, what I take from that, so I hope I'm taking from it the same thing that the questioner intends, is the idea that, you know, it's possible to burn out in relation to some of these issues because it feels that things are so set in place, you know, that it's possible to feel hopeless and to, you know, find it difficult to keep on plugging away. I mean, I think, you know, I suppose my experience as a psychologist is that we're very often working with people who are facing difficulties that you know, appear to be incredibly difficult to find a way through. And of course, we know that in relation to some of these issues, both in terms of race, but also other forms of discrimination and equity, you know, there are massive kind of structural barriers that we're tackling and dealing with every day. So it's not, you know, it's not to say this is easy and, you know, you should just feel cheerful about it because it's all going to be okay, because, you know, these are really difficult things. I suppose coming from what we've heard today, there's some kind of common themes about what are important ways of keeping going through some of this. And that is about coming together, sharing experiences, you know, being able actually to think about where there are some things to push at. I think it was Tansy in the presentation who was saying, you know, pushing at a door that's already beginning to open. That's certainly my experience of lots of things in working in the NHS. The NHS is a really slow-moving machine in some ways, but there are always things that you can be pushing at and can be trying to move forward. And I think that's really important in dealing with this sort of area as well. I mean, I guess I'm aware in answering that question, I'm coming again from a particular position, aren't I? I'm in a particular position of power, so it might be easier for me to think, well, it's easier to make things happen. And I'm sure that other people will have a very different take on this and a different experience. I suppose, again, there is something important about connecting and being ready to hear those voices. So like the last question, you know, why is it that you might need to have a particular group for people with a particular set of experiences to talk in a protected way? I think, you know, if out there there's the idea that maybe that's not necessary and that discriminates against other majority groups, I think we need to all be joining together to challenge some of those sorts of narratives, because those things are necessary. They are a really important step. And we need to be protecting those. And I, in my position, need to be playing my part in protecting those too. So anyway, I feel like I'm waffling now, and I'm definitely more guilty of that than Leila was, who I don't think was waffling at all. So I'm going to hand back over to you, Margo.
Thanks, Bill. And I went to you on purpose first because I think it's really important, no matter what, how we identify, that the importance of allies and finding people who are there, who are open to listen, who can make change is really important in this. And before I move over to Leila, I just wanted to share some research that I did at a doctoral level with one of my trainees. And what was interesting was we were looking for burnout being related to one's ethnic identity. We didn't find that. We found burnout much more, this was within the NHS, to be related to system factors, to the pressure of work, the whole gambit that the NHS is facing. And even though we were targeting and asking questions around ethnicity, it didn't come to fruition. So we didn't ask about white supremacy, and that's not a term I would choose to use because I don't put one group of people over another myself, but that is a term that's out there. But I think we have a lot of similarities as well, particularly in the concept of burnout. That's important to remember. And Leila, over to you.
Thanks, Margo. The TIDE studies tackling institute discrimination. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I don't think I've even remembered it properly, but there's a TIDE study that have done a lot of work working with people, staff within the NHS and people using services, and had found that racism and discrimination played a very key role in terms of people's mental well-being. So I think in relation to burnout, I agree there's a lot of systemic factors there in terms of the way the mental health system works that is going to really affect all staff members. But more specifically, I think maybe there's something about racial battle fatigue, which is an area of work that we're looking at the moment. Myself and some other colleagues. And when we think about workplace discrimination and accumulative race-related stresses, see, that's not burnout, but that can contribute to burnout. The personal experiences of loss or bereavement, where there's any kind of inequity related to that. navigating care for loved ones who are caught up in the system, who are repeatedly sectioned, providing support within your own community and within your family where you see injustice and abhorrent practices. I think those things can contribute to burnout. So I think there's something about racial battle fatigue, which I think we need to think about a bit more, but there's systems things like Margo said that need to change there, I think. And also just being exposed to repetitive media reports of the injustice and racism, which unfortunately, every day, just yesterday, we heard about that young boy who died, and the BABCP wrote a statement on that because of mold in a flat. You know, there's social issues within the structures, within the communities that we inhabit. We can't deny them, they're everywhere. And we need to make sure that we have that context when we're working with others as well, but we also need to look after our staff. So yeah, I could talk for ages on it, but let me pause because I don't want to monopolise, Margo.
Thank you, Leila. And you are absolutely right. It is a tied study. Somebody's just clarified that in the chat for us as well. So thank you. And I think it's so right that inequalities and stresses and things that lead to burnout is just everywhere. It's inherent throughout society. And there's a lot of work to be done wherever you choose to do the work. So, Bill, over to you for your final thoughts.
So, final thoughts. So I suppose the first thing is just to thank all of our panel members. I think it's been a really thought-provoking session today. I'm glad that we've been able to take all of those questions, including, some of those questions that touch on some really challenging questions and topics. I suppose the one question I wanted to respond to in a kind of closing sort of way, there was this question about funding. And I do think that, again, there's lots and lots of things that are out there. And I don't want to in any way say, this is all getting solved now, because there's an awful lot of long-term work to be done. But it is significant, I think, that particularly in the psychological professions, we have seen funding relating to this issue, funding to set up these different paid roles, funding for mentoring for members of staff from BAME communities on the trust side, funding for courses to look at how they work with issues of equality and diversity. Now, I know that, some of the work you're doing, Margo, is about looking at how are those initiatives landing and what sort of impact are they having. But I do think it's really significant that, that's core Health Education England money that's coming into the psychological professions to target some of these issues. And of course, we've all got to make sure that that lands and has a really meaningful impact. But I suppose that's a little bit of a kind of, positive note about where we're getting to with some of these issues and something for us all to keep working on. But it's been great to work together again on this session this year, Margo, and I'm interested to hear your final thoughts.
Thank you. And it's been great to work with you too, Bill, because I think what's so interesting on the journey I've had with the Psychological Professions Network is how open it is to change. I feel comfortable to be open and direct in relation to issues around equality, diversity and inclusion, and I felt heard and listened to. And I hope that gives a message of hope out there to people, because I haven't always felt that way and I haven't always had that experience. And so I think there is a lot of hope out there. I'm definitely seeing more initiatives across the country. People are really trying. People are getting it wrong at times, which is why I wanted the person who's mentioned about the trans question to let me know, because then I can help people to understand. And I suppose I'd like to finish this by, again, thanking the panel for joining us today and also for the recordings. An extra special thank you to my research assistant on this project, who I couldn't do this project without, Tessa Thomas, who's arranged all this, put together the recording, met with my colleagues to do the recordings, and of course, the reason why we're here, the reason why we do the job that we do, is to help people with their emotional well-being. So my final thanks goes to Paul. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all the hard work that you do for the psychological professions and indeed for my programme. So I hope you've enjoyed today's workshop. I hope it's been thought-provoking, giving you some ideas, and we'd love to know your feedback via the feedback form that will come. So on behalf of Bill and myself and the panel, thank you all for joining us today.